The doctors couldn't save the millionaire's wife, who felt unwell at the restaurant, but the cleaning lady rushed to help, and everyone was left. But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. The opulence of Manhattan's Sapphire Dining Hall glittered under the golden chandeliers, reflecting the celebration of wealth and status. Benjamin Harlow, a renowned real estate tycoon, sat proudly at the head of a long mahogany table adorned with exotic flowers and crystal glasses. Beside him, Victoria Harlow, his elegant and poised wife, clinked her glass of champagne in a toast to their 15th wedding anniversary. Guests from every echelon of high society surrounded them, laughing, drinking, and savoring the gourmet cuisine. Victoria, however, seemed distracted. Her eyes darted around the room, and her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. "I'm feeling a bit lightheaded," she whispered to Benjamin. He glanced at her, his brow furrowing with concern. Before he could respond, her complexion paled, and she slumped forward, knocking over her glass in a loud crash. Gasps echoed through the hall. "Someone call a doctor!" Benjamin roared, his voice trembling with panic as he cradled Victoria. The maitre d' hurriedly summoned emergency responders while the guests stared in shock. Among the staff observing the chaos from a distance was Grace Whittaker, a reserved cleaning lady who had been quietly polishing the windows at the far end of the hall. As the commotion grew, Grace's gaze sharpened. While the guests stood paralyzed, two doctors from the crowd rushed forward but appeared hesitant. They argued about potential heart issues, debating the right course of action without making any moves. Victoria's breathing grew shallow, her lips turning faintly blue. "I can't just stand here," Grace murmured to herself. She pushed through the onlookers, kneeling beside Victoria. "Excuse me," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "She needs immediate CPR." The doctors hesitated, but stepped aside as Grace leaned over, checking Victoria's airway and pulse with practiced precision. "She's in cardiac arrest," Grace declared. Without waiting for permission, she began chest compressions, her movements steady and controlled. A few murmurs of disbelief rippled through the room. "Who is she?" one guest whispered. "Isn't she just the cleaning lady?" Benjamin hovered nearby, his face a portrait of confusion and fear. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Saving her life," Grace replied curtly, continuing her compressions. A minute later, Victoria coughed weakly, her eyes fluttering open as she gasped for air. Grace sat back on her heels, her expression a mixture of relief and focus. The paramedics arrived moments later, rushing Victoria onto a stretcher and out the door. Benjamin's gratitude was overshadowed by astonishment. "Who are you?" he stammered, staring at Grace. Grace wiped her hands on her uniform, standing up without meeting his eyes. "Just someone who knew what to do," she replied simply, retreating to the shadows of the kitchen. As the guests whispered and the restaurant returned to a tense hush, one thing was clear. The mysterious cleaning lady had saved Victoria's life. But how had she known exactly what to do? And why did she seem so reluctant to stay in the spotlight? The questions lingered, hanging in the air like smoke, as Benjamin made a quiet vow to find out more about Grace Whittaker. The hospital room was sterile, yet filled with an air of tension. Machines beeped softly as Victoria Harlow lay on the hospital bed, her eyes barely open, but stable. Her doctor assured Benjamin that, while her condition was critical, the swift intervention at the restaurant had saved her life. "If not for the CPR," the doctor said gravely, "she might not have made it this far." Benjamin nodded, but his mind lingered on Grace Whittaker. The way she'd stepped in with calm authority haunted him. Who was this woman? How did she know exactly what to do when even trained doctors hesitated? Back at the Sapphire Dining Hall, Benjamin found himself searching for her. He caught sight of her in the back room, seated alone at a small metal table with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. She looked tired, her uniform slightly rumpled, but her posture was firm, almost guarded. "Miss Whittaker, is it?" Benjamin asked, his deep voice resonating in the small space. Grace looked up, her green eyes sharp but wary. "Yes, sir," she replied, standing as if bracing for a reprimand. "I need to thank you," Benjamin began, stepping closer. "What you did tonight, you saved my wife's life. I owe you everything." Grace shook her head, her expression stoic. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Harlow. I just did what anyone with the right training would do." "But you're a cleaning lady," he said bluntly, the words escaping before he could consider their weight. "How do you know CPR? The way you handled that?" Grace's lips tightened. "I learned some things in my past," she said curtly. "Excuse me, sir, but I have work to finish." Her abruptness only deepened Benjamin's curiosity. "Please," he urged, his voice softening, "at least let me offer you something in return. A reward, perhaps. Anything." Grace froze, her shoulders stiff. "I don't need your charity," she said quietly, her tone cool but edged with pain. "I'm glad your wife is alive. That's enough." Before Benjamin could reply, she walked past him, disappearing into the hall with her mop and bucket. Over the next few days, Benjamin's thoughts were consumed by Grace. Meanwhile, Victoria's condition improved steadily, though she remained unusually withdrawn. She avoided conversations about the incident, often staring out the window with an expression Benjamin couldn't decipher. Unable to let go of his curiosity, Benjamin called in a favor with a private investigator. "I want to know everything about Grace Whittaker," he instructed. "Where she's from, what she's done, and why someone with her skill set is working as a cleaning lady." The report arrived 2 days later. It revealed a past more complicated than Benjamin had imagined. Grace Whittaker, 34, was once a promising surgeon with a stellar record at a prominent hospital in Chicago. But 7 years ago, she abruptly resigned and disappeared from the medical field entirely. The investigator noted vague rumors of a malpractice lawsuit, though the details were sealed. Benjamin sat back, stunned. A surgeon? He couldn't reconcile the idea of a woman with such a prestigious background scrubbing floors in a Manhattan restaurant. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Victoria, her face pale but her steps deliberate. "Benjamin," she said, her voice steady but low, "we need to talk about what happened that night. About Grace." He looked at her, confused. "You've met her?" Victoria hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Not exactly. But I think there's more to this than we realize. I need to see her alone." "I owe you my life," Victoria began, her voice soft but resolute. "You don't owe me anything," Grace replied, her gaze steady but cautious. Victoria studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Maybe not, but I think we both have things we're trying to bury. And it might be time to stop running." Grace stiffened, but she didn't walk away. Victoria's words hung between them, heavy with implication, as if the lives of these two women were tied together by something far deeper than a single life-saving moment. The heavy rain mirrored the storm, brewing within Benjamin's mind. He stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, gripping the investigator's report in one hand and a glass of bourbon in the other. Grace Whittaker, a name now tethered to an enigma. A surgeon turned cleaning lady, and somehow his wife seemed to know more about her than she was willing to admit. Inside, Victoria rested on the plush sofa, her eyes fixated on the crackling fireplace. She'd been unusually silent since her brief encounter with Grace. It wasn't just gratitude lingering in her expression. There was something darker, a weight Benjamin couldn't place. "Victoria," he called softly, stepping inside. She looked up, startled, as if pulled from deep thought. "Yes," she replied, her voice distant. You mentioned the other night that you needed to speak with Grace. Why? Victoria hesitated. The words caught in her throat. I just needed to thank her. That's all. Benjamin studied her. It didn't seem like just gratitude to me. The tension in the room thickened. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the teacup on the table. Benjamin, please let it go. She saved my life. That's what matters. But Benjamin couldn't let it go. He decided to dig deeper. The next morning, Benjamin returned to the Sapphire dining hall. He found Grace on her knees, scrubbing the grout between the marble tiles in the foyer. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. "Mr. Harlow," she said, her tone neutral. "Grace, I need answers," he said, crossing his arms. "You're not just some ordinary person. Why are you here?" Grace straightened, leaning on the mop handle. Her jaw tightened. "What does it matter?" "It matters to me," Benjamin pressed. "I don't believe in coincidences, and I don't believe someone with your skills ended up here by chance." Grace sighed, her gaze drifting. "It's not a story you want to hear, Mr. Harlow. Trust me. Try me," he challenged. Her lips pressed into a thin line before she finally relented. "I was a surgeon," she admitted, "one of the best in my field. But 7 years ago, everything changed." Her voice wavered as she continued. "There was a patient, a child. A routine surgery went wrong, and I made a mistake. It cost him his life." Benjamin's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Grace. That must have been devastating." She nodded, swallowing hard. "The lawsuit ruined my career, but the guilt ruined me. I left everything behind. Medicine, Chicago, my old life." Her eyes met his, filled with a haunting vulnerability. "This job, it's penance. A way to stay invisible while I try to live with myself." Benjamin was about to speak when his phone buzzed. A text from Victoria lit the screen. "We need to talk. Now." Victoria handed him a small box. "Open it," she urged. Inside was a vial of medication. Benjamin frowned, confused. "I've been taking it for months," Victoria confessed. "It's experimental. I didn't tell you because it wasn't approved yet." Grace knew what it was. She recognized the symptoms when I collapsed. Benjamin's eyes widened. "You mean she knew?" Victoria nodded. "She saved me because she understood exactly what was happening. But there's more." She hesitated before dropping the bombshell. "Grace wasn't just a surgeon. She's the one who pioneered this treatment." The weight of her revelation hit Benjamin like a tidal wave. Grace's past was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was intricately tied to their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. Meanwhile, Grace was alone in the dining hall's break room. The memory of her confession to Benjamin lingered, leaving her raw and exposed. She traced the edges of a faded photograph in her hand, a picture of the young boy she had failed to save all those years ago. Her solitude was interrupted when Victoria walked in, her fragile frame wrapped in a trench coat. "Grace," she said softly, her voice echoing in the empty space. Grace stiffened but didn't look up. "Mrs. Harlow." Victoria stepped closer. "You and we're not so different. We've both made choices we regret, but that doesn't mean we can't make things right." Grace's fingers tightened around the photo. "Some things can't be fixed," she murmured. "But some things can," Victoria countered. "And maybe that's why we found each other." For the first time, Grace met her gaze, and in that moment, a fragile connection began to form. Two women bound by their pasts, and perhaps their future. The air inside the Harlow residence was suffused with unease. Benjamin paced the room, clutching the investigator's report and replaying Victoria's revelations in his mind. Grace Whitaker wasn't just a survivor of her own mistakes. She was deeply intertwined with the experimental drug that had become Victoria's lifeline. Victoria sat on the edge of the sofa, wringing her hands. "You're upset," she said, breaking the silence. "Upset?" Benjamin shot back. "That doesn't cover it. You've been taking an unapproved drug, collapsing at public events, and now I find out the woman who saved you not only knows this treatment, but is tied to it. This isn't coincidence. It's a mess." "It's not as simple as you think," Victoria replied, her voice rising. "I was dying. The treatment was my only option. And Grace, whether you like it or not, she saved me." Benjamin stopped pacing, staring at his wife. "Do you trust her?" Victoria hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I do." Every corner brought memories she'd tried to bury. The sterile corridors of the Chicago hospital, the faces of her colleagues when she left, and the moment she realized her mistake would cost more than her career. She stopped at a small cafe and ordered coffee, her fingers trembling as she held the warm cup. Her solitude was short-lived. Benjamin appeared, shaking off rainwater as he stepped inside. "Grace," he said firmly, sitting across from her, "we need to talk." Grace looked away, clearly irritated. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" "No," Benjamin replied bluntly. "Not when my wife's life is involved." Her jaw tightened. "I already told you what you wanted to know." "Not everything," he said, leaning forward. "You were part of the team that developed the drug Victoria's taking. Why did you abandon it? And why didn't you tell anyone what you knew when she collapsed?" Grace's eyes flashed with anger. "I abandoned it because I couldn't face the world after what I'd done. The trial was my responsibility, and when it failed, when that boy died, it became a stain I couldn't erase." "But it didn't fail, did it?" Benjamin pressed. "Victoria is alive because of your work." Grace clenched her fists. "You think that erases what happened? The boy wasn't just a patient. He was my nephew. I killed him with my ambition. That's not something you fix with a success story." Her voice broke, and Benjamin was momentarily silenced. He hadn't expected the raw pain behind her words. "Grace," he said softly, "you have a gift. And right now, you're the only person who can help Victoria." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stood, leaving her untouched coffee behind. "I've already done enough," she said, walking out into the rain. Later that night, Victoria woke to find Benjamin sitting at her bedside, deep in thought. "What are you planning?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Grace needs to come back," he said. "Not just for you, but for herself. She's hiding from the world, but she doesn't realize how much good she can still do." Victoria nodded. "Then help her see it." The next morning, Benjamin returned to the Sapphire dining hall. He found Grace in the supply room, organizing cleaning supplies with mechanical precision. "I'm not interested," she said without looking up. Benjamin sighed. "This isn't about interest. It's about purpose. You're wasting yourself here, Grace." She turned, glaring at him. "You don't get to decide that." "No, I don't," Benjamin admitted. "But the world does. And right now, it needs you. My wife needs you. You need you." Grace's resolve cracked slightly, but she shook her head. "I can't go back." Benjamin pulled out a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "Then tell him that." She unfolded the paper and froze. It was a handwritten letter addressed to her, penned by her late nephew before the surgery. The words were simple but heartfelt. "You always make me feel safe. I know you'll do your best, Auntie Grace." Tears filled her eyes as she read it. "Where did you get this?" "I found it," Benjamin said gently. "And I think he'd want you to stop running?" "It's Grace. I'll do it." On the other end, Benjamin smiled. The operating room at St. Jude's Hospital was a whirlwind of motion. Doctors and nurses moved in unison, the atmosphere thick with urgency as Victoria Harlow's vitals wavered on the monitors. She had suffered a sudden relapse, her breathing shallow and her heart erratic. The team's lead surgeon barked orders, but it was clear they were losing control. The doors burst open and Grace Whittaker stepped inside. Dressed in scrubs, her presence immediately commanded attention. For a moment, the room fell silent, the staff exchanging uncertain glances. "Who is she?" one of the nurses whispered. "I'm here to save her," Grace said firmly, walking to the head of the table. "If you want her to live, you'll let me take over." The lead surgeon hesitated, his pride warring with his instinct to step aside. "Are you even qualified?" Grace's voice was like steel. "More than you are for this case." Victoria's heart monitor let out a sharp, warning beep. That was all the answer the surgeon needed. He stepped back, nodding reluctantly. "She's all yours." Grace worked with precision, issuing orders with confidence that reignited the room's energy. Her hands moved deftly, a symphony of skill honed by years of experience, even if dormant until now. In the waiting room, Benjamin sat with his head in his hands, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Time felt infinite and cruel. A nurse appeared, her face unreadable, and Benjamin shot to his feet. "Is she stable?" the nurse said. "But she's not out of the woods yet. Grace Whittaker is still working with her." Benjamin exhaled sharply, relief and anxiety warring within him. He turned to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked city, silently willing Grace to succeed. Hours later, Grace emerged from the operating room. Exhaustion lined her face, but there was a glint of triumph in her eyes. Benjamin stood, his heart pounding. "Is she—" "She'll recover," Grace interrupted softly. "It wasn't easy, but she'll recover." The words hit him like a wave. He reached out, gripping Grace's shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her." "Again!" Grace stepped back, shaking her head. "She saved me too," she replied, her tone laden with meaning. Victoria's recovery was slow but steady. As days turned into weeks, she began to regain her strength. Grace visited her often, their bond deepening as they shared stories of their respective battles with guilt and resilience. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the hospital room's curtains, Victoria reached for Grace's hand. "You've given me so much more than my life back," she said. "You've given me perspective, a chance to start fresh." Grace smiled faintly. "You did the same for me." Grace stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling out of place among Manhattan's elite. Benjamin approached her, holding a glass of champagne. "You know," he said, "none of this would have been possible without you." Grace gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "I'm just one piece of the puzzle." "A vital one," Benjamin corrected. "Victoria and I owe you a debt we can never repay." Grace looked at him, her eyes clear and calm. "You already have," she said simply. The story didn't end there. Grace returned to medicine, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. With Benjamin and Victoria's support, she spearheaded a foundation to provide medical care for underprivileged children, ensuring no family would face the barriers she once had. The Foundation's first major project was a state-of-the-art children's clinic in Chicago, named in memory of her nephew. During the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Grace stood before the crowd, her voice steady as she spoke. "This is for the boy who taught me the cost of ambition, but also the power of redemption, and for every child who deserves a chance at life." Applause erupted as she cut the ribbon, tears glistening in her eyes. Months later, Grace returned to Manhattan for a quiet dinner with the Harlows. As they sat together, laughing and sharing stories, it was clear that their lives were forever entwined, not by tragedy, but by the shared power of second chances. In the end, the shadows of the past had given way to a brighter future, one shaped by courage, compassion, and the unyielding drive to heal.